That brings me to the other big report we had tonight. We led with this breaking news. I got to ask you about the other big thing going on, which is as the Senate prepares to put Donald Trump on trial, you have the reports about who's going to defend Trump. White House counsel Pat Cipollone, Jay Sekulow, who defended him in the Mueller probe. New York Times reporting Alan Dershowitz might have a role on the team. But this, of course, leaving one big name out in the cold, Rudy Giuliani. And we should note, before I go back to Mr. Flannery, there are a few reasons to leave Giuliani out. He's under criminal investigation. There's the problem that he's a potential witness about this plot. Even Trump allies admit that. And then there's the remarkable fact that he's the first defense lawyer to ever get a presidential client impeached, a twist worth reflecting on. In fact, we checked, and look how a top Republican put this back in 2018. If a university had a course in how to create an atmosphere where impeachment becomes plausible, the president would bring in people to do damage control who deliver more damage, which is the outcome of the addition of Rudy Giuliani. And it's Giuliani who pushed the Ukraine conspiracy theory on Trump and carried out the plot, which got Trump impeached. And while some Republicans defend Trump by arguing nothing came of the efforts, Giuliani's been undercutting that defense. He returned to Ukraine with a camera crew, as we reported. He's in trouble tonight for his efforts. So with all that in mind, look at something else we haven't had time to mention yet. Consider this new CNN report that now Giuliani is still lobbying the White House to get on the team to defend Trump in the Senate, arguing he knows the case against the president inside and out. Giuliani dying to get in there. To paraphrase John Fogerty, he is pleading with the boss, put me in, coach. I'm ready to play today. Look at me. I can be, you know how it goes, center field. Trump's own allies saying, no way. They don't trust Giuliani to argue a parking ticket. Another source saying Giuliani will not be speaking on the Senate floor. They don't trust him. They prefer him, Mr. Flannery, back on the bench. Your view of Giuliani's now publicly leaked efforts to get a speaking role at this Senate trial that starts as early as Tuesday.
Well, I'm torn. I'd like to recommend that they put him in that position. You know, some others might prefer my cousin Vinny instead, but I think that Giuliani is in a very peculiar position because if you remember his statement about I have insurance, I wonder how much that insurance is helpful to get him off the bench and on the team and into the room. I can imagine there are very few Republicans that want him in there who've thought about it. But there is one person who might think he should be there. I mean, after all, Trump has continued to use him even after as a fixer. He's shown himself not even to be anything like Michael Clayton, the movie in which we had a real fixer, not like Michael Cohen or like Rudy Giuliani. And it looks like he does disclose more about what a person's done wrong than defend against it in any fashion that would serve him or serve the president in a trial before the Senate. I think it's unlikely he'll be there, but we've seen a lot of unlikely things happen in this case.
Yeah, and the George Clooney, Michael Clayton character, he did gamble too much. You don't necessarily want your counsel to be too into taking big gambles, right, professionally or personally. I wonder what you think if we play this out. If we take Giuliani at his word, that he is still lobbying to get on the team for this trial next week, that the president, for whatever reason, has not cut him loose. I mean, it would have been easier to treat him as Donald Trump has treated many other people, including so-called self-declared fixers. For whatever reason, Giuliani stayed in a different category, having gotten the president impeached. But if he were in this trial, John, how would it then work when he is the author of this new letter we can put back up on the screen, when his new evidence is that he's not only defense counsel, I think we'll put the new letter that just broke out, and he's actually, as it says here, I'm private counsel to President Trump, and I want to basically, as using the privileges of the president, private citizen are not the same. We have separate representation, and he goes on to try to arrange this meeting to get the investigation. How would that play out if he were also his lawyer at trial?
Well, you know, for a lawyer who is a material fact witness and to be an advocate, thereby having that obvious conflict, such a lawyer under normal ethical circumstances should not be the advocate in a case. And in fact, he might appropriately be, as we've discussed before, a witness in the case, but it'll be a witness who seems to have the kind of evidence that convicts his client or friend or person he represents or the Tudo de Tupi, the warlord that had him doing all these things by this back channel. So now, The objections in the Senate, I don't know that if I were on the team of the House managers, I would object to him testifying, because there are so many documents that allow you to control anything he would say for a good cross-examiner. It would be a dream to cross-examine Rudy Giuliani, it seems to me. That's not true of some people we don't have information about, and Bolton might be one of those. But Rudy Giuliani is a witness that I would enjoy cross-examining as a House manager.
Not everyone has dreams about who they would cross-examine, but that shows you're still the prosecutor at heart. I have a 30-second break to fit in. I appreciate you, as always, on the two big stories tonight, John. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.